It all began with a tree, an ancient sprawling oak that stood proudly in the center of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Its thick trunk was knotted with history, its bark scarred by time, and its roots buried deep beneath the soil of generations. Locals said it had been there long before the neighborhood even existed, before the first paved road or the first mailbox. It had survived storms, droughts, and even a developer's bulldozer decades ago. When the current homeowner, Daniel Harris, bought the property 10 years earlier, the oak had been one of the main reasons he fell in love with the place. Its wide canopy shaded most of his front yard, and in summer, its leaves shimmered like emerald glass in the sunlight. It wasn't just a tree, it was a landmark. Birds nested there every year. Children had grown up playing beneath its branches. Even neighbors would stop and take photos when the light hit just right through the leaves. But not everyone saw beauty in its age. The trouble began the day a new HOA president took over. Linda Crowley, a woman whose obsession with control was known throughout the subdivision. She was the kind of person who measured grass with a ruler, sent warning letters for slightly faded mailbox paint, and considered herself the guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. To her, Daniel's Oak was not a historic treasure. It was an eyesore, a liability, and, as she would later claim, a threat to community safety. Daniel first noticed her attention when she began driving past his home slowly, clipboard in hand. Soon after, he received his first HOA notice. The letter was short but firm. The oak tree on his property was in violation of landscaping regulations due to its overhanging branches and potential root damage risk. He was instructed to remove it within 30 days. The notice left him stunned. That tree had been inspected by arborists more than once. It was perfectly healthy. Its roots extended deep but not dangerously. It had never once dropped a major branch or damaged nearby structures. The only thing the tree seemed guilty of was existing on land controlled by someone who didn't like it. Daniel initially thought it was a mistake. Perhaps the HOA was unaware of the tree's protected status under the town's historical preservation laws. But when he tried to reason with them through letters, he received more threats instead, warnings of escalating fines, legal fees, and potential liens on his property if he failed to comply. The tone of the HOA letters grew increasingly hostile. Linda's signatures appeared at the bottom of every one. She was relentless, citing bylaws and fabricated safety hazards. It was clear that this was no misunderstanding. This was personal. Rumors began to spread around the neighborhood. Some whispered that Linda wanted the tree gone because it blocked her view of the sunset. Others said it was because she wanted to raise property values by enforcing uniform landscaping. Whatever her motive, her determination was ruthless. Daniel found himself in an impossible position. Cutting down the oak would cost thousands, destroy part of the character of his property, and, worst of all, erase a piece of the town's living history. But resisting the HOA risked financial ruin. He lay awake at night, staring through his window at the ancient silhouette outside. Its branches swayed gently in the moonlight, as if whispering defiance against the injustice closing in. As the 30-day deadline approached, the HOA intensified their pressure. Daniel began receiving daily notices taped to his door. Some were slipped into his mailbox, others pinned to his front gate. Each one carried the same message: remove the tree or face penalties. But then, on the final week, something happened that changed everything. One morning, Daniel woke up to the sound of chainsaws. Through his window, he saw a group of men in bright vests standing near the oak. They were marking its trunk with orange paint, preparing to cut. No warning, no permission, just action. His heart raced as he ran outside, realizing that the HOA had sent a private contractor without even consulting him. By sheer luck, a neighbor had recorded the entire scene on their phone. The contractors, confused and uneasy, eventually stopped when they realized Daniel was the homeowner and that there was no city permit. But the damage was done, not to the tree, but to Linda's case. That moment sparked something in Daniel. The fear he'd been living under turned into fury. He began digging through the HOA's own rules, city laws, and property codes. The more he read, the more he realized just how many boundaries Linda had crossed. The oak wasn't just a tree. It was legally protected as part of the town's heritage tree program. Any attempt to remove or alter it without a permit was a violation punishable by steep fines, and the HOA, by sending contractors onto his land without consent, had potentially committed trespassing and property damage. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, legal forms, and old photos of the tree dating back decades. The injustice had gone too far, and now he had proof that could turn the tide against the HOA that had tried to bully him into submission. As the wind rustled through the oak outside, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't just going to fight back, he was going to make sure the HOA paid dearly for what they'd done. And when the sun rose the next morning, it wasn't just another day under the shade of an old tree. It was the beginning of a war that would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. Daniel didn't sleep that night. His kitchen table had turned into a war room, a chaos of documents, envelopes, old photographs, and legal printouts spread across every inch of wood. The glow from his laptop screen flickered on his tired face as he scrolled through pages of city ordinances, state statutes, and homeowner rights. Each click brought him closer to understanding the depth of the HOA's mistake. The oak outside his window stood silent, a black silhouette against the dawn sky. To most it was just a tree, but to Daniel it had become a symbol of something much bigger, freedom from a system that thought it could control everything. He began with the Heritage Tree Registry. After hours of research, he located an old town council record from the 1970s that listed his oak by name. It wasn't just any tree, it was registered as a protected historical specimen. The record included photographs and a signed declaration from the town's former mayor confirming that the tree was to be preserved for as long as it stands. Any entity attempting to alter or remove it, without official approval, could face legal penalties up to $50,000 per incident. Daniel couldn't believe it. Linda had either failed to check this, or worse, ignored it entirely. Next, he looked into the HOA's bylaws. Buried deep within pages of legal jargon, he found a clause requiring homeowner consent for any property modification or contractor work. That meant when the HOA had sent workers onto his land, they had violated their own governing rules. Trespassing, unauthorized entry, property interference, each offense carried its own legal weight. The more Daniel uncovered, the more confident he became. Linda's arrogance had led her straight into a legal trap of her own making. Still, Daniel knew he couldn't just march into a courtroom unprepared. HOAs were notorious for fighting dirty, often backed by aggressive attorneys and deep pockets funded by homeowners' fees. He needed more than just anger, he needed proof. So he started gathering evidence. He took photographs of the orange paint still marked on the tree's trunk. He collected the HOA notices, carefully organizing them by date. He downloaded the neighbor's video that showed the contractors approaching his property. Then he visited the local city office, where he requested public records, permits, inspection reports, and any communications the HOA might have filed. What he found there stunned him. The HOA had never filed for a removal permit. In fact, the file contained a letter from the city's urban forestry department denying the HOA's previous attempt to classify the oak as a hazard tree. Linda had tried and failed once before, but instead of stopping, she had simply decided to take matters into her own hands. It was now undeniable. This wasn't just overreach. It was a deliberate act of abuse of power. Over the next week, Daniel consulted with a property rights attorney, a calm, meticulous man named Carter who specialized in HOA disputes. Carter listened carefully to the details, reviewed the documents, and after several long hours, leaned back in his chair and told Daniel something that changed everything. The HOA was liable for damages, trespassing, and attempted property destruction of a protected landmark. They could be fined by the city. They could be forced to pay restitution. And if proven to have acted knowingly and maliciously, the HOA board members themselves could be held personally responsible. Daniel felt the first flicker of satisfaction in weeks. The fear that had gripped him began to fade, replaced by a calm determination. The HOA had tried to break him through intimidation, but now the tables were turning. Carter drafted a formal complaint letter addressed to both the HOA and the city attorney's office. It outlined every violation in excruciating detail, complete with citations, evidence, and legal precedents. The letter gave the HOA 7 days to respond before legal proceedings would begin. When the letter was hand-delivered to the HOA office, the neighborhood began to buzz. Word spread quickly that Daniel was fighting back, and not quietly. Homeowners whispered about what was happening behind closed doors. Some even began pulling out their own HOA notices and wondering what else the board had gotten away with. Linda didn't take it well. Within days, Daniel received another letter, this time dripping with hostility. The HOA claimed his accusations were baseless, that the tree posed a community hazard, and that he was engaging in defamation against the association. It was an attempt to scare him into silence, but it only made things worse, because by then, the city inspector had already visited Daniel's property. The inspector confirmed everything. The tree was healthy, structurally sound, and under active protection. He documented the illegal paint markings, took photos for his report, and promised that the city would be following up with a formal notice of violation against the HOA. Within a week, that notice arrived, and it was devastating. The city fined the HOA $25,000 for unauthorized entry and attempted removal of a protected tree, with the potential for additional penalties pending investigation. The letter was made public record, and soon every homeowner in the subdivision had heard about it. The once powerful HOA president, who had ruled with fear and arrogance, now found herself at the center of a storm of outrage. Residents began attending meetings demanding accountability, some even calling for her resignation. The board tried to contain the fallout, but the cracks in their control were showing. Daniel didn't stop there. His lawyer filed a civil suit against the HOA for damages and emotional distress, citing the months of harassment and the illegal attempt to alter his property. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive, and yet, even as the legal gears began to turn, Linda refused to back down completely. She started a quiet campaign of retaliation, spreading rumors, sending veiled threats, and trying to rally other board members to her side. It was clear that she wasn't just fighting to save her position. She was fighting out of pure spite. But what she didn't realize was that Daniel had one final piece of evidence she didn't know about. An internal HOA email chain that would destroy her case completely. It had been given to him anonymously by another board member who had finally grown tired of her tyranny. And when that email came to light, the real downfall of the HOA was about to begin. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, tucked between the usual pile of utility bills and junk mail. It was unmarked. Its only feature a neat handwritten note on the front that simply read, "You'll want to see this." Daniel almost threw it away, assuming it was another anonymous letter of support or a complaint from a neighbor tired of the ongoing drama. But something about the handwriting made him pause. It was clean, deliberate, someone who wanted him to know, but not be known. Inside were several printed emails, each one dated and time-stamped, with subject lines that sent a chill through him before he even began to read. The first line of the top message said it all. "We'll move forward with the removal regardless of the permit status. He'll give up once he sees the contractors on his lawn." It was signed by Linda Crowley. The rest of the thread revealed everything. The secret conversations between HOA board members planning the illegal tree removal, their discussions about how to handle Daniel, and even suggestions on how to manipulate other residents into siding against him. But the most incriminating detail wasn't just the words, it was the attached file name mentioned in one of the messages. Budget Allocation, Tree Removal Fund, PDF. That single phrase implied something much darker, that HOA funds, homeowners' money, had been secretly diverted to hire the contractors for the unauthorized job. Daniel sat at his dining table, staring at the pages, feeling both stunned and vindicated. The battle that had started as a petty feud had now turned into something criminal. This wasn't just an abuse of authority, it was fraud. He immediately called his attorney, Carter, who was silent for a long time after hearing what Daniel had found. Then, with measured calm, he explained what this could mean. Misappropriation of HOA funds was a serious violation of state law. Not only could it invalidate the board's authority, but individual members could be held personally liable. Carter moved fast. Within 24 hours, he filed an amended claim, now including allegations of financial misconduct and misuse of community funds. The emails were submitted as evidence, verified through digital metadata tracing back to the HOA's official server. The ripple effects were immediate. When the HOA board received notice of the filing, panic spread like wildfire. Emergency meetings were called. Some members resigned quietly. and others began trying to distance themselves from Linda. But her name was on every document, her tone evident in every line of those messages, condescending, dismissive, and dripping with self-righteousness. The neighborhood that once feared her now turned against her. Homeowners began gathering in driveways and at the park, whispering about what was happening. Copies of the public complaint circulated online through local Facebook groups. Comments exploded with outrage, people furious to learn that their dues had been used for personal vendettas. Daniel, once the target of scorn for fighting the HOA, suddenly became the symbol of resistance. Neighbors who had once avoided him now stopped by to offer quiet support, slipping him handwritten notes or words of encouragement. For the first time, the fear that had blanketed the community began to lift. Meanwhile, Linda grew increasingly desperate. She stopped appearing at meetings, sending curt statements through the HOA's lawyer instead. The once meticulously groomed woman who drove around inspecting lawns now stayed hidden, blinds drawn, her car absent from the driveway for days at a time. But the real turning point came when the city's legal department, already investigating the tree incident, caught wind of the new evidence. They opened an official inquiry into the HOA's financial management, freezing its discretionary accounts pending review. Without access to funds, the HOA's operations began to crumble. Maintenance projects halted. Community services went unpaid. Homeowners received letters from vendors threatening lawsuits over unpaid bills. It was total collapse, an empire of control brought down by its own arrogance. Through it all, Daniel stayed calm. He didn't gloat or lash out. He continued documenting everything, every communication, every sign of mismanagement. His lawyer advised patience. The longer they let the HOA implode, the stronger their case would become. Then, 2 weeks later, came the hearing notice. The city had scheduled a formal administrative hearing to review the violations. Both Daniel and the HOA board were required to appear. It would be the first time they faced each other since the conflict began. On the day of the hearing, Daniel arrived early. The conference room inside City Hall buzzed with tension. Reporters and local bloggers filled the back rows, drawn by the now viral story of the HOA versus Heritage Tree scandal. Even the mayor's office had sent a representative to observe. When Linda finally entered, she looked nothing like the confident, controlling woman Daniel remembered. Her expression was tight, her hair disheveled, and she clutched a stack of papers as if holding them together could somehow hold her life together too. The proceedings began with the city attorney summarizing the case: unauthorized removal attempts, trespassing, financial irregularities, and misuse of HOA funds. One by one, the pieces of evidence were presented: the photographs, the city's inspection report, the contractor statements, and finally, the email chain. When Linda's messages were read aloud, the room fell silent. Each word, once typed carelessly in a private exchange, now echoed in a public chamber. Her arrogance was laid bare before everyone, her disregard for law, property, and the trust of the very people she claimed to protect. The verdict was decisive. The city imposed an additional $50,000 fine against the HOA for fraudulent use of funds, along with an order for the immediate removal of Linda Crowley from her position as HOA president. The board was dissolved pending re-election, and an independent financial audit was ordered to trace every dollar spent under her administration. As Daniel left the hearing, the weight that had haunted him for months finally began to lift. The oak tree stood tall in the distance when he drove home that afternoon, its branches swaying gently as if applauding the justice that had finally been served. But deep down, he knew the story wasn't over yet. Because while the HOA had been punished, the legal battle for restitution, the six-figure lawsuit that would make them pay for everything they'd done, was just beginning. And Linda Crowley, humiliated and furious, wasn't done trying to fight back. For a brief moment, peace returned to the neighborhood. The HOA meeting stopped, the endless violation letters disappeared, and for the first time in months, Daniel could step outside without feeling the weight of eyes watching him from behind curtains. The oak tree stood untouched, its massive branches spreading proudly above the quiet street, a living monument to victory. But beneath that calm surface, something darker was brewing. Linda Crowley had vanished from public view after her removal, but silence wasn't the same as surrender. In the weeks following the hearing, Daniel began noticing small signs that she was still lurking in the background. The HOA office phone number was disconnected. Yet anonymous flyers started appearing on community mailboxes, accusing Daniel of destroying neighborhood unity. Someone spray-painted the word traitor on the sidewalk near his driveway. Then came the late-night knocks, always faint, always brief, just enough to make him wake up and wonder if he had imagined it. Linda's power may have been stripped away formally, but she still had allies, people she had manipulated for years with fear and false promises. A handful of them, still loyal, began organizing informal meetings in their garages and living rooms. They claimed they were trying to rebuild the HOA and restore order, but everyone knew who was behind it. Meanwhile, Daniel's lawsuit pressed forward. His attorney Carter was methodically gathering witness statements, invoices, and bank records for court submission. The independent audit of the HOA's finances uncovered even more corruption than anyone had expected. Thousands of dollars of community funds spent on personal expenses, spa treatments, car detailing, and even an out-of-state leadership retreat that Linda had billed as board development. The media loved it. Local news outlets began running headlines like HOA scandal deepens and ex-president accused of embezzlement. The story spread beyond their town, gaining traction in HOA forums and online drama channels. Linda's name became synonymous with greed and arrogance. But while Daniel's case grew stronger, so did Linda's desperation. Through back channels, she tried to contact him. She sent unsigned letters claiming she had evidence that could clear everything up if he agreed to drop the lawsuit. He ignored them. Then she started spreading rumors that he had fabricated the emails, that he was secretly profiting off the scandal through online publicity. The lies didn't hold up, but they stirred tension among neighbors. People began taking sides again. Some saw Daniel as a hero standing up against corruption. Others, weary of the constant drama, blamed him for the HOA's collapse and the neglect of shared spaces. Trash bins sat uncollected. The entrance sign grew overrun with weeds. What had once been a pristine, tightly controlled community was now unraveling. Daniel felt torn. He had never wanted chaos. He just wanted justice. But justice, it seemed, had a price. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the oak tree, casting long shadows across his yard, Daniel noticed a small envelope tucked beneath his front doormat. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in bold type. "You don't understand what you've started." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He recognized the tone immediately. It was Linda. The letter reignited something inside him, not fear this time, but determination. If she wanted to intimidate him, she would fail. He had come too far to back down now. He turned the note over, scanned it again, and saw faint traces of smudged ink, part of an address that had been accidentally printed at the bottom corner. It led to a P.O. box at a neighboring town's postal center. Carter advised him not to engage, but Daniel, curious by nature and still furious over everything she'd done, couldn't help himself. He visited the postal center the next day, pretending to inquire about a lost parcel. There, he caught sight of a familiar name on a nearby rental log, Crowley, L. It confirmed what he suspected. Linda was still orchestrating her schemes from afar. Within days, the situation escalated. A false complaint was filed with the city's code enforcement office, claiming Daniel's oak tree was rotting internally and posed a danger to public safety. The report came from an anonymous source, but the city official who inspected the property recognized the name on the contact file. It was Linda's handwriting on the form. The city dismissed the complaint after verifying the tree's health again, but this time, they issued a formal warning to Linda. Further harassment would result in criminal charges. Daniel realized he wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. He was fighting for accountability. Every move Linda made now only dug her deeper. Then, in a stroke of poetic irony, the HOA's insurance provider refused to cover any of the fines or legal costs associated with her actions. Their policy excluded willful misconduct. That meant all restitution would have to come directly from the HOA's reserve funds, or from Linda herself. When the final phase of Daniel's lawsuit began, the damages were tallied: property interference, emotional distress, unauthorized entry, and defamation. Carter's firm calculated the total claim at $187,000. Linda tried to countersue for character damage, but the court dismissed her case almost immediately. The evidence against her was overwhelming. In the weeks that followed, her reputation completely collapsed. Former board members testified that she had bullied them into compliance, threatened homeowners with baseless fines, and ignored multiple legal warnings. The judge ordered a full restitution payout to Daniel and mandated that Linda be permanently barred from holding any HOA leadership role in the state. The final judgment hit like thunder. The HOA was to pay Daniel $150,000 in damages and an additional $30,000 in legal fees. The remaining costs were placed directly on Linda. Personally, money she didn't have. The day the ruling was announced, Daniel returned home to find his mailbox overflowing with letters, some from neighbors thanking him, others expressing regret for not standing up sooner. But what mattered most was the quiet, unwavering presence of the oak tree outside. Its branches seemed to stretch a little higher that evening, as though celebrating its own survival. Still, even in victory, there was unease, because a week later, Linda's house went dark. Her car disappeared from the driveway, and when the new HOA elections were finally announced, someone had slipped Daniel an anonymous note inside the community bulletin box. The tree may have won, but the roots run deeper than you think. For a few fleeting weeks, the neighborhood seemed to settle back into uneasy normalcy. Lawns grew a little longer, fences stood unpainted, and the streets carried a strange quiet, like a battlefield after the smoke clears. The HOA was officially dissolved pending reorganization, and a temporary committee of volunteers was formed to handle basic maintenance. Daniel was finally free. No more notices, no more harassment. The oak tree stood unchallenged, a century-old survivor casting shade over a property now known across the town as the house that beat the HOA. But victories in small towns rarely stay simple. One afternoon, Daniel received a call from Carter. The attorney's tone was cautious, measured in a way that instantly made Daniel sit up straighter. The court had processed the judgment, and the HOA's assets were being liquidated to satisfy the damages. But something wasn't adding up. When auditors began reviewing the HOA's financial records to gather payment, they discovered missing funds. Not a few thousand. Nearly $70,000 had vanished from the HOA account within the last 3 months of Linda's presidency. The money had been withdrawn in multiple small transactions, enough to avoid automatic reporting, but large enough to cripple the association's reserve. The audit report traced the withdrawals to a single vendor, Crowley Consulting, LLC. Daniel's stomach turned as Carter explained that the business had been registered just months before the conflict began, with Linda's name listed as both the owner and sole employee. She had been quietly paying herself through fake consulting fees, funneling community money into her own pocket under the guise of professional services. It was more than corruption now. It was embezzlement. Carter forwarded the findings to the city attorney, and soon the local police's financial crimes division opened an investigation. Subpoenas were issued. Bank statements were requested. The story that had once seemed like neighborhood gossip was about to explode into something far bigger. Meanwhile, the community itself began fracturing. Homeowners who had once idolized Linda now felt betrayed and angry. Those who had been loyal to her clung to denial, insisting it was all part of Daniel's vendetta. Tension filled every street corner, every community gathering. Neighbors avoided eye contact when passing each other at the mailbox. Then, late one night, something unexpected happened. Daniel was awakened by flashing lights outside his window. 2 police cruisers idled in front of Linda's house, their headlights illuminating her overgrown lawn. From his porch, Daniel watched as officers carried boxes out of the home, computers, files, documents. The local news confirmed it the next morning. Linda Crowley had been formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, and falsification of financial documents. The news rippled through the neighborhood like lightning. For some it was vindication, for others it was embarrassment. But for Daniel it was something more profound, a confirmation that he had been right all along. The oak tree hadn't just survived. It had exposed the rot beneath the surface of an entire system. Still, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something else was hiding underneath it all. A few days later, a manila folder appeared in his mailbox, unmarked except for a small note that read, "You deserve to know everything." Inside were more documents, bank transfers, emails, and contractor invoices. But these weren't from Linda. They were from other board members. The papers revealed a long-running pattern of small-scale kickbacks, landscaping companies overcharging for work, pool maintenance services billing for unused hours, and board members quietly approving it all in exchange for referral bonuses. Linda hadn't acted alone. She'd just been the boldest. The corruption had roots that stretched back years, long before Daniel ever moved into the neighborhood. It all came together with chilling clarity. The HOA had become less about maintaining property standards and more about maintaining control of people, of money, of power. And for years, no one had questioned it. Daniel brought the new documents to Carter, who added them to the growing web of evidence being passed to investigators. The city attorney's office expanded its case to include multiple former board members. Subpoenas turned into indictments. The once pristine neighborhood that had prided itself on order was now the epicenter of one of the biggest HOA corruption scandals the county had ever seen. Local reporters camped outside for interviews. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing footage of the oak tree, now a symbol of defiance. It became a story that resonated far beyond the community, a tale of one homeowner standing against unchecked authority and winning. But Linda, even while awaiting trial, refused to fade away quietly. In a final act of defiance, she filed for bankruptcy to avoid paying the restitution. The move stalled payments to Daniel temporarily, forcing him to endure another round of legal motions. Yet it also opened the door for investigators to comb through her financial records, and that's when the final secret surfaced. Hidden in her accounts was a large payment from a regional developer, a real estate company that had once expressed interest in purchasing several lots in the area. The timing matched perfectly with her push to remove the oak tree. It became clear what Linda's true motive had been all along. The developer had planned to buy and redevelop multiple properties into luxury units, but the oak tree, protected by its heritage status, sat squarely in the middle of the expansion zone. Removing it would have cleared the path for a profitable deal, one that Linda would have quietly benefited from through her consulting company. Her war against Daniel hadn't just been personal. It had been business. When this revelation hit the public record, the case took on national attention. Linda's name became a cautionary tale, cited in news segments and HOA reform discussions. She eventually accepted a plea deal, probation, community service, and full restitution, including the payment to Daniel in full. The day he received the settlement check, Daniel didn't celebrate. He simply walked outside, stood beneath the oak's canopy, and let his hand rest against the ancient bark. The same tree that had once made him a target had now become a monument of justice. But even as the wind rustled through its leaves, he noticed something new, a small wooden stake near the sidewalk with a plastic tag fluttering against it. It bore the logo of the same developer involved in Linda's deal. The tag marked a survey boundary line. Daniel frowned, pulling it out of the ground. It was a reminder that victory was never final, that greed always had a way of growing back. The battle might have been over, but the roots of corruption were still alive, just waiting for the next opportunist to come digging. Months passed and slowly the neighborhood began to heal. The scandal that had once divided the community now served as a warning etched into its collective memory. The HOA was officially dissolved for good, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood committee run by homeowners who had sworn never to repeat the mistakes of the past. The streets were quieter now. The rules were fewer, the threats gone, and at the center of it all, Daniel's oak tree stood taller than ever, its branches dense and full, its roots gripping the earth like an anchor, holding the entire community in place. But victory, Daniel had learned, is rarely the end. It's just another beginning. The morning after discovering the survey stake near his sidewalk, he contacted the city planning office. The clerk confirmed his worst suspicion. A development company had recently filed an inquiry to reassess boundary limits for the lots surrounding his property. No official construction permits yet, just exploratory mapping. But Daniel had seen enough of how those things started. One small adjustment, one administrative oversight, and history would repeat itself. He refused to let that happen. This time, he moved before anyone else could. He gathered every document related to the oak, the heritage certification, the inspection records, the legal rulings. Then he went further. With Carter's help, he filed a petition to elevate the tree's protection status from heritage tree to landmark tree, a special classification reserved for only a handful of natural monuments in the state. It was a long bureaucratic process. There were hearings, forms, evaluations by environmental scientists, and endless waiting. But Daniel persisted. He spoke at town meetings, presented photos of the oak through the decades, and shared its history, the families it shaded, the storms it had survived, the justice it had come to represent. Neighbors who once kept their distance now stood beside him, signing petitions and writing letters of support. The same people who had once feared Linda's HOA now rallied behind the oak as a symbol of community resilience. Even the local news followed the story, calling it the tree that took down the HOA. Months turned into a year, and then, one crisp autumn morning, Daniel received the news he'd been fighting for. The city council had voted unanimously to designate the oak tree a state-protected landmark. It could never be removed, altered, or disturbed, not by developers, not by homeowners, not even by future city governments. It was now permanent, unmovable, untouchable. The day the bronze plaque was installed at the base of the oak, Daniel stood quietly as workers mounted it into the soil. A small crowd of neighbors gathered, clapping softly as the covercloth was lifted to reveal the inscription. The Harris oak planted circa 1905, protected in perpetuity as a living symbol of history, integrity, and community justice. For a moment, Daniel just looked at it in silence. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above, scattering golden light across the plaque. He thought about everything that had happened, the letters, the threats, the courtroom battles, and the long nights filled with doubt. All of it had led to this. But even as peace settled in, the past hadn't fully disappeared. Linda Crowley had left town after her sentencing. Her house was sold at auction to cover debts, her name erased from community records. No one saw her again, though rumors occasionally surfaced, whispers of her moving to another state, trying to join a different HOA under a new name. But wherever she went, she could never escape what she had become. The cautionary tale of the HOA president who tried to destroy a tree and ended up destroying herself. For Daniel, life returned to a quiet rhythm. He worked in his garden, repaired the fence she once complained about, and occasionally waved to passing cars that slowed to admire the now famous oak. Sometimes people would stop to take pictures or leave small notes beneath the plaque. Messages like, "Thank you for fighting," or "This tree gives me hope." Yet, on certain nights, when the wind moved through the branches just right, Daniel could swear he heard the faint echo of chainsaws, the ghosts of that morning when the battle first began. He would glance out the window, the way he did back then, and watch the silhouette of the oak sway gently against the moonlight. It no longer felt like a fight. It felt like guardianship. A year later, the developer officially withdrew their proposal. The oak's new protected status had made any construction nearby legally impossible. Daniel received a short letter from the city planner's office confirming the cancellation. At the bottom was a handwritten note from the same clerk who had handled his case months earlier. "The tree wins again." He smiled when he read it. That evening, he sat beneath the oak for the first time in a long while, listening to the hum of cicadas and the soft rustle of leaves. The air carried the same peace that had drawn him to this home all those years ago. The neighborhood was no longer under the rule of an HOA. There were no fines, no warning letters, no self-appointed dictators measuring lawns. Instead, there was something better: respect. Homeowners talked to each other again, shared tools, helped maintain shared spaces voluntarily. The community had rediscovered what it meant to live side by side without control or fear. As twilight deepened, Daniel traced his hand across the oak's bark, rough and cool under his fingertips. He realized then that the tree hadn't just survived because of him. It had helped him survive too. It had grounded him through every storm, every threat, every betrayal. And now it stood eternal, not just as a piece of nature, but as proof that standing your ground, even when you're alone, can change everything. When he finally rose to go back inside, he looked up one last time. The oak's branches stretched high into the fading light, whispering softly in the evening breeze. And in that quiet moment, he understood the truth that the HOA had never grasped. Some things can't be owned, controlled, or cut down. Some things are meant to stand, and this tree, this 100-year-old oak, would stand forever.